Hello there, it's Deborah Irene with Storytime, continuing in my series with stories and lessons from my mother, Helen Herbert Gillum. And we're going to read in her book, Helen's Heritage, about the oldest boy in the clan, James Melvin. But before we get started and reading that story, I wanted to go back to the story that I read last week about the oldest child and oldest girl, Elizabeth Leona. I mentioned that the story that I read to you called from my book Someday I Will Write, after I read the piece about Aunt Lizzie from my mother's book, I also read you the story that I had written in my book Someday I Will Write about their home, and I called that story A House, a Home. I think I mentioned to you that that story was picked up by a magazine, and I just wanted to show you a copy of that magazine. This was in Country Magazine. This is the August-September 2016 issue of Country Magazine. And they wrote a condensed version of that story. They didn't take much out. And they called it Heart of a Home, The Gathering Place. And then they asked me for some pictures. And so in the article, and this is a national magazine, they ended up choosing the picture of Aunt Lizzie and Uncle Hike that I had in that accompanied my story, but then they also chose a picture that was taken during the time that my mother's mother, Mag, was, I think this was right before she died, and several of them had gathered back in Missouri because she was ill. And so there are 7 of the 8 sisters. All of them were there except for the one who had passed away. That's kind of a neat picture there. I don't know if you can see it, but it has Aunt Lizzie, Elnora, Aunt Clara, my mother, Helen, Louise, Aunt Eunice, and Aunt Delta in there. And then they decided to put this picture here because they could tell it was the gathering place. This picture here is actually of my father and my sister Vicky. This picture was taken on, I believe it was either New Year's Eve or Christmas. It was Christmas when they were playing cards, and that's something we used to enjoy doing at Aunt Lizzie and Uncle Hike's. So I just wanted to share that with you. So today we are going to read about the oldest boy, and his name was James Melvin, and we all called him Mel. So this is my mother, Helen Herbert Gillum's oldest brother, Mel. Let me show you these pictures of him. We put several pictures of him in here. We found one of him as a baby here, and then here as an older grandpa. And then down here, and we'll read a little bit about this. We came back to Missouri one time on a visit, and he came with us. And he took us all around on the grandpa on my other side of the family, the Gillum side. He actually visited there with us, and my grandpa had Shetland ponies, and he took all of us around for rides on the Shetland ponies. And then there is also a picture down here of some of the other siblings in the clan. That picture is Aunt Clara, Mel, and that was just shortly before he passed away, my Uncle Robert, and my Aunt Lizzie that we read about last week. So let's read about Mel. He was quite a character. 1 year after the birth of Lizzie, the firstborn son, James Melvin, arrived on February 19, 1906. He was called by his shortened middle name, Mel. He and his wife, Amanda Hook, Mandy, had 15 children, so they certainly did their part in carrying on the Herbert name. They knew the heartache of bearing a child too. They lost one baby boy at 3 months old before I was born, I being my mother, a teenager in 1943, and then another teenager 20 years later in the early 1960s. Mel had a large family of his own when I was growing up in Polk County, Missouri. Many of his children were older than I. He first moved to California alone and lived with Mama for a while. Mandy and the children came later. In many ways, he was like a father figure to me. His daughters, Betty and Nova, were more like sisters to me than nieces. I enjoyed being with them. I want to pause here for a minute and say something specifically for my extended family who may be watching this. So those of the family who are still in California, this is how many of you got there. Mel's descendants, most of them, are still in California. And it's because after Grandma moved to California, then Mel was one that followed her out there. And so that's why his children and their children are mostly all in California. And I do remember Betty and Nova. They were more like aunts to me when we lived there, and they were very close with my mother, Helen. So let's continue on in her voice. Mel always joked around and amused everyone with his sense of humor. He loved to cook and garden. He had Mama's green thumb. He helped me in many ways when I moved to California. I specifically recall that he helped me drive to Missouri for a vacation visit with my daughters when I had an eye infection and Charles couldn't go. We stopped by Charles's folks' place where the kids rode the Shetland ponies. He escorted all of them. He made us laugh. He died in Fillmore, California on January 13, 1980. Just a month before his 74th birthday. He is buried in Santa Paula. It's hard to imagine that at the time of this writing, I received word that the last of his children had died, Alan, in California. However, he has many descendants, and the Herbert name continues. And these were his 15 children. Everett Ross, I believe they called him Ross, was born in 1926 and he died a young man in 1943. Betty Doris, 1928, she was born and she died in 2008. Earl Jr., born in 1929 and died in 1988. Roy Lee, 1930 to 1931. That was the infant that passed away. Nova Jean, she was born in 1934, same year as my mother, and passed away in 1977. BJ was born in 1936 and died in 1993. Wilbur Dell was born in 1939 and died in 2001. Paul Wesley, born in 1940, died in 2013. Alan Richard, born in 1943 and died in 2015. Melvin Raymond, born in 1944 and died in 1963. We were still living in California. I remember when he passed away. It was a hit and run accident. He was a pedestrian, and he was killed while he was walking. Benny Ray, born in 1945, died in 2012. William Donald, born in 1947, died in 1985. Floyd Dean, born 1948, and he died in 2007. Then the last two girls, Carolyn Marie, born in 1950, passed away in 2000, and Linda Kay, born in 1951, passed away in 1999. Something else that I would like to say about my Uncle Mel. I remember when he helped out my mother, and he was always a lot of fun to be around. And I actually have two pictures in my book, Someday I Will Write, with Mel in them. I wrote a story about my other side of the family called Family Ties, but I happened to put in here a picture of my Aunt Fran, that's my dad's sister. But look, we're on some of the kids are on the ponies again, and look who's escorting them. It was Mel. And then at the back of my book, I wrote a little story about horse racing and my love for that. And there again, I have a picture of me on one of the Shetland ponies, and there's Mel again, escorting me around. He was a good uncle and a good brother. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the oldest boy in the Herbert clan, James Melvin, reading from my mother's book, Helen's Heritage. It's Deborah Irene with Storytime, stories and lessons from my mother.